The large silver ship descended slowly through Earth's atmosphere on a clear morning in May 2087. People across the globe watched on screens as it hovered above the United Nations headquarters in New York. No one knew what to expect. This was humanity's first contact with beings from another world. Jack Miller straightened his tie and took a deep breath. As Earth's chosen representative, the weight of first contact rested on his shoulders. The tall, gray-haired diplomat had spent 30 years solving conflicts between nations. Now he would speak for all of Earth. "Remember, they traveled very far to reach us," said Lisa Clark, walking beside him toward the meeting room. "They must want something." Lisa was a cultural anthropologist, brought in to observe and analyze the aliens' behavior. She was shorter than Jack, with dark skin and observant eyes that missed nothing. "Let's hope it's just friendship," Jack replied, forcing a smile. The aliens called themselves the Vorax Confederacy. Their ambassador stood nearly 7 feet tall with blue-tinted skin and 4 arms. His name was impossible for human tongues to pronounce, so he allowed them to call him emissary. "We have watched your civilization with great interest," the emissary said in perfect English, his voice oddly musical. "Your species has accomplished much in a short time." The first meetings went well. The Vorax shared limited information about their technology and culture. They spoke of peace and cooperation between worlds. World leaders began to relax. Markets stabilized after the initial shock of first contact. But Lisa noticed things others missed. The way the Vorax guards positioned themselves in rooms. How their eyes tracked human military personnel. The strange devices they always kept close. "They're assessing our strengths and weaknesses," she told Jack after the 4th day of talks. "I studied dozens of first contact scenarios in human history. The Vorax are behaving like conquerors, not friends." Jack took her concerns to his superiors, but the evidence seemed too thin. No one wanted to risk offending Earth's first alien visitors based on a hunch. On the 7th day, everything changed. The Vorax ships appeared without warning above 3 major Earth cities: Beijing, London, and Rio de Janeiro. The attacks began minutes later. Energy weapons tore through buildings. Smaller craft deployed ground forces. Earth's military scrambled to respond, but their weapons barely damaged the alien ships. Jack was in the middle of negotiations when alarms blared through the building. The emissary stood, all pretense of friendliness gone from his face. "Your species represents an unpredictable threat," he stated coldly. "The Confederacy cannot allow such a variable to exist unchecked." Security guards rushed in, but the emissary's bodyguards cut them down with strange weapons. Jack pulled Lisa under a heavy table as energy blasts destroyed the room around them. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, watching as the aliens left, believing everyone dead. They crawled through rubble and smoke to reach the emergency stairs. Outside, New York was in chaos. Alien ships filled the sky, and strange troops marched through the streets. 6 weeks later, Jack sat in a basement with other survivors, listening to a scratchy radio. Half the world's major cities were under Vorax control. Conventional military forces were falling back everywhere. The aliens' technology was simply too advanced. "We can't beat them in a fair fight," said a former general on the broadcast. "But we don't plan to fight fair anymore." Lisa looked at Jack across the dim room. "They thought they understood us," she said quietly. "That was their first mistake." Jack nodded. The Vorax had studied human armies, weapons, and tactics, but they had missed something essential about humans. When backed into a corner, they changed the rules. "They expect soldiers in uniform," Jack said, an idea forming. "What if our deadliest fighters don't look like soldiers at all?" 6 months into the Vorax occupation, Earth's remaining military leaders gathered in an underground bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. Maps covered the walls showing vast areas of red territory now controlled by the aliens. The blue areas, representing free human settlements, grew smaller each week. General Henry Walsh stood at the head of the table. His weathered face showed the strain of sleepless nights and lost battles. He had commanded armies for 20 years, but nothing had prepared him for fighting an enemy from the stars. "Conventional warfare is failing," he said, his voice echoing in the concrete room. "Every time we deploy tanks or jets, the Vorax destroy them before they get close." A woman with short gray hair raised her hand. "Then we stop fighting conventionally." All eyes turned to Susan West. Before the invasion, she had led special operations teams into the world's most dangerous places. Now she represented what remained of those elite forces. "The Vorax expect us to fight like a military," Susan continued. "They study our uniforms, our weapons, our tactics. But what if they couldn't tell who was a soldier and who wasn't?" General Walsh nodded slowly. "A new kind of warfare." The plan they developed that night would change the course of the war. They called it the Phantom Protocol. Small teams of elite fighters would abandon their uniforms. They would blend with civilian populations in occupied territories. They would use everyday items as weapons when possible. Most importantly, they would strike where the Vorax least expected. 2 weeks later, Susan sat in a small apartment in what used to be downtown Denver. The city was now a Vorax administrative center. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a faded t-shirt, and a jacket that hid a knife and 2 small devices developed by human scientists still working in hidden labs. "Remember, we're not trying to win battles," she told the 4 people sitting with her. "We're creating chaos." None of them looked like soldiers now. Peter had been a Marine sniper. Now he looked like a tired office worker. Kelly had commanded a destroyer. Today she resembled a college student. Rick and Diane had both been special forces. They could now pass for a married couple in their 30s. "The Vorax think in straight lines," Susan explained. "They expect attacks from armies, not from the clerk who serves them coffee or the mechanic who fixes their stolen human vehicles." That night, they carried out their first mission. A Vorax communication relay stood on what had once been a public park. The aliens guarded it heavily, with soldiers and energy barriers. But they never checked the underground maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the city. Rick and Diane, posing as utility workers, placed small devices near power junctions. At exactly midnight, the devices activated. The power grid throughout the sector failed. As the Vorax scrambled to restore connections, Susan's team emerged from different directions, appearing to be confused civilians caught in the blackout. They reached the relay during the 3-minute window when the backup systems were still booting. Peter disabled 2 guards using a weapon that looked like a flashlight. Kelly planted the explosive device. Disguised as a common tablet computer, Susan kept watch, noting how the aliens moved and communicated during the crisis. They were blocks away when the relay exploded. The blast wasn't large, but it was precisely targeted. The Vorax lost communication across Denver for 12 hours. Similar teams carried out operations in Chicago, Atlanta, and San Francisco that same night. None wore uniforms. None used military vehicles. None left evidence of who they really were. When the Vorax commander for North America reviewed the security footage, all he saw were ordinary humans caught in the confusion. His report back to the Vorax High Command contained a disturbing observation. "The humans have no visible military presence, yet our installations are failing. Every civilian must now be considered a potential threat." That was exactly what General Walsh had hoped for. The Phantom Protocol had begun, and the aliens' greatest advantage, their ability to identify and target Earth's military, had just become useless. Susan West stood at the window of an abandoned apartment building, watching Vorax patrol vehicles move through the streets of Chicago. 3 months had passed since the first Phantom operations. The alien occupiers had grown visibly nervous. "They're checking everyone twice," said Alan Garcia, studying the aliens through binoculars. Before the invasion, Alan had been a middle school science teacher. Now he led Phantom Team Alpha alongside Susan. No one would have guessed this quiet man with gentle eyes could plan operations that left Vorax commanders baffled and afraid. "Good," Susan replied. "That means it's working." The psychological impact of the Phantom Protocol had exceeded all expectations. Vorax soldiers, used to identifying enemy combatants by their uniforms and formations, now faced an invisible enemy. They jumped at shadows. They trusted no one. Their once precise military operations became clumsy as they devoted more resources to security. Tonight would push them further toward the breaking point. Everyone ready? Susan asked, turning to the 6 people gathered in the room. They nodded. None looked remarkable. They wore the plain clothes of survivors in an occupied city. They carried ordinary bags and backpacks that concealed carefully designed weapons and tools. They had memorized their routes and timing down to the second. "Remember, we're not just destroying equipment tonight," Susan said. "We're planting the seed that humans are unpredictable. That's what scares them most." The target was a Vorax research facility in downtown Chicago. Intelligence suggested they were studying human psychology there, trying to understand how to better control the population. The team split into pairs and left through different exits. They blended with the evening crowds, humans hurrying to reach their homes before curfew. Vorax checkpoints stopped them multiple times, scanning them with alien devices, but found nothing suspicious. Alan and Susan approached from the north, posing as janitors with appropriate identification badges stolen weeks earlier. The Vorax had taken over human infrastructure but still relied on humans for much of the maintenance work. "Act hired," Susan whispered as they approached the facility's service entrance. "Like you've done this job for years and hate every minute." The guard barely looked at them, waving his scanner over their IDs before returning to his conversation with another soldier. The aliens had grown complacent about the humans who kept their buildings clean and functioning. Inside, they moved with purpose toward the central research lab. Their forged access cards worked perfectly. The few Vorax scientists they passed paid them no attention. Meanwhile, the other team members created carefully timed distractions across the city. Small explosions damaged power lines. Communications suddenly failed in key Vorax strongholds. A supply depot reported intruders, drawing security forces away from the research facility. Susan and Alan reached the main laboratory and found what they were looking for: data storage devices containing the aliens' research on human behavior. As Susan downloaded the files, Alan examined a wall covered in diagrams of human brain patterns. "They really don't understand us at all," he said quietly. The data revealed the Vorax's fundamental misunderstanding of humans. They saw the human tendency to adapt and improvise as a flaw rather than a strength. Their military doctrine was based on rigid hierarchy and predictable responses, the opposite of what the Phantom Protocol encouraged. When they left 20 minutes later, they took not only the research data, but also planted evidence suggesting the break-in had been carried out by aliens from a rival faction. The confusion this would cause among the Vorax commanders would be as valuable as the stolen information. Across the occupied territories, similar operations unfolded. The Vorax commander, Krithol, responsible for Earth's subjugation, received reports of incidents that made no tactical sense. Unlike human military leaders he had studied, these attackers followed no recognizable doctrine. They struck without warning and vanished without a trace. "How can we fight an enemy we cannot see?" one of his subordinates asked during an emergency meeting. Krethol had no answer. For the first time since the invasion began, the aliens felt something they had not expected from the technologically inferior humans: fear. 1 year into the war, Earth's situation had changed dramatically. Humans still didn't have the technology to match Vorax weapons, but the Phantom teams had spread worldwide. What began as a desperate tactic had evolved into humanity's best hope. Major Diane Powell stood in the rain, looking like any other tired refugee. Her dirty coat and worn shoes hid her true identity as the coordinator of Phantom operations in the western United States. No one would guess this small woman with streaks of gray in her hair had once commanded fighter jets. She checked her watch. 2 minutes until it began. The massive Vorax battle cruiser floated above the ruins of San Francisco. Even grounded, it was an impressive sight. nearly a mile long with weapons that could level mountains. The aliens had brought it down for repairs after a lucky hit from one of Earth's few remaining missile bases. All teams in position, said a voice in the tiny device hidden in Diane's ear. She gave a slight nod, knowing her teams could see her through scopes and cameras. 20 Phantom operatives were about to attempt the most daring mission yet, capturing an intact Vorax ship. The aliens had grown increasingly brutal in recent months. Frustrated by their inability to identify Phantom teams, they had begun punishing entire human settlements for acts of resistance. They thought fear would make humans surrender. They were wrong. As planned, explosions erupted across the city, not at the ship itself, that would have triggered immediate lockdown protocols. Instead, the Phantoms targeted infrastructure 3 miles away from the cruiser. Vorax soldiers poured from the ship, racing toward the disturbance. The aliens' rigid command structure was predictable. They always responded with overwhelming force to any attack. Diane walked calmly toward the now lightly guarded ship. 5 others approached from different directions. They all carried identification marking them as human technicians approved to assist with repairs. The few guards remaining at the ship's entrance barely glanced at their IDs. The Vorax still couldn't believe humans would directly attack something as powerful as a battle cruiser. Inside, Diane's team moved quickly. They had memorized the ship's layout from intelligence gathered over months. 4 Phantoms headed for the engine room. Diane and another operative named Paul made for the command center. "Remember, we need the communication systems intact," Diane whispered. They encountered 3 Vorax officers. Paul disabled them with a weapon disguised as a maintenance tool. It emitted a pulse that disrupted the aliens' neural functions for several minutes without killing them. On the bridge, Diane accessed the main computer while Paul secured the doors. Years of studying stolen Vorax technology had given human scientists enough knowledge to understand basic commands. "I'm in," she said after 2 tense minutes. "Downloading now." The data flowed into a device no bigger than a coin. It contained everything: Vorax fleet positions, communication protocols, and most importantly, the weaknesses in their systems. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Alan Garcia's team faced disaster. Their mission to disable a Vorax command center had been discovered. 3 Phantoms were already dead. Alan and 2 others were pinned down in an abandoned building. "We need to complete the mission," Alan said, his teacher's voice now hard with determination. He looked at the faces of his remaining team, a former accountant named Sam and a college student called Kate. Both nodded. They understood what was at stake. Using the last of their explosives, they created an escape route through the building's basement. The blast killed many Vorax soldiers, but also Sam, who stayed behind to trigger it. Alan and Kate reached the command center's power supply. With their specialized equipment destroyed, they had to improvise using the building's own electrical system. Kate rewired it to create a power surge while Alan kept watch. The resulting overload disabled the command center just as Diane's team secured the battle cruiser in San Francisco. That night, the highest-ranking Vorax commander sent an urgent message to his homeworld. "The humans have captured one of our ships. They fight without uniforms or military structure. Request immediate reinforcement and specialist hunter teams." The war was entering a new phase. The data stolen from the Vorax battle cruiser changed everything. Human scientists spent weeks analyzing it, making discoveries that no one had thought possible. The aliens' technology was advanced, but it had weaknesses. Mary Johnson sat in a dimly lit room, studying the information. Before the invasion, she had been a behavioral psychologist at a major university. Now she worked with the Phantom Protocol, finding ways to use the alien psychology against them. "They're connected," she explained to the group gathered around her. "Not just through their communications technology. Their minds are linked in some kind of network." Jack Miller nodded slowly. In the 15 months since first contact, the former diplomat had become one of the Resistance's key intelligence officers. "That explains their coordination. And their weakness," Mary added. "They think as one. They can't handle chaos or unpredictability because their shared consciousness seeks order. Susan West leaned forward, her experienced eyes seeing the potential immediately. So we don't just attack their technology. We attack their minds. The Vorax hunter squads had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Unlike regular alien troops, these specialists were trained to identify and eliminate phantom operatives. They studied human behavior patterns and used advanced scanning devices to detect the subtle signs of military training. Several phantom teams had already been lost. But the hunters had a critical flaw. They still fought like Vorax. They still expected humans to follow logical patterns. In a small apartment in what was once Boston, Susan met with Jack to plan their most daring operation yet. The room was sparse but clean, looking like the home of an ordinary survivor rather than a resistance headquarters. "We need to get to their flagship," Jack said, pointing to a rough map. "That's where they coordinate the hive mind network." Susan raised an eyebrow. "The one in orbit? We'd need a ship." "We captured one, remember?" Jack smiled. "Diane's team has it hidden in the mountains. Our scientists have figured out enough to make it fly again." The plan they developed was crazy by any military standard. It relied entirely on the Vorax inability to comprehend human improvisation. While Susan and Jack would attempt to infiltrate the flagship, Mary Johnson would lead a worldwide effort to confuse and distract the alien neural network. 2 days later, Mary sat with 50 former psychologists, actors, and behavioral experts. They had worked out patterns that would create maximum confusion in the Vorax hive mind. "Remember," she told them, "they can't filter information like we can. Every contradiction, every unexpected behavior feeds directly into their shared consciousness." Across Earth, phantom teams received strange new orders. Instead of destroying Vorax equipment, they would now perform actions that made no tactical sense. Some would stand in open areas, clearly visible, then disappear. Others would arrange human artifacts in patterns that meant nothing but would trigger the aliens' pattern recognition instincts. Meanwhile, Jack and Susan boarded the captured Vorax cruiser along with 8 other phantom operatives. None wore uniforms. They dressed like ordinary civilians, but carried the most advanced weapons humans had developed by reverse engineering alien technology. "Ready?" Susan asked as the ship's engines hummed to life. Jack nodded, though his hands shook slightly. "Just like negotiating with difficult diplomats. Except they want to kill us." The cruiser rose from its hiding place in the Rocky Mountains. Its identification codes, still valid in the Vorax network, allowed it to climb toward orbit without challenge. Below, Mary's psychological warfare began. Phantom teams across the world created chaos and confusion in the alien ranks. The Vorax neural network, designed for order and hierarchy, struggled to process the contradictory information flooding in from thousands of sources. As the captured cruiser approached the massive Vorax flagship, Earth's conventional military forces launched simultaneous attacks on alien bases worldwide, not to win battles, but to add to the confusion. On the flagship's bridge, the Vorax Supreme Commander felt something new: doubt. For the first time, the certainty of victory wavered in the collective mind of the invasion force. Operation Masquerade began at dawn. Across the planet, phantom teams activated simultaneously. There was no radio communication, no central command giving orders. Each team had memorized their part and would act independently. This was humanity's greatest advantage: the ability to coordinate without constant connection. Alan Garcia moved through the early morning streets of Seattle. The city now served as the western headquarters for the Vorax occupation. He wore the uniform of a human maintenance worker. The aliens still relied on local labor for many basic tasks. ID demanded a Vorax guard at the entrance to the main power facility. Ellen presented his forged card with the confidence of someone who had done it hundreds of times. 4 other phantom operatives had already entered through different doors, each carrying components disguised as repair tools. "The air system on level 3 is malfunctioning again," Alan said, sounding bored and slightly annoyed. The guard waved him through. The Vorax had grown so accustomed to human workers that they no longer saw them as threats. This blindness would cost them dearly today. In orbit, the stolen Vorax cruiser approached the massive alien flagship. Susan and Jack stood on the bridge, wearing the clothing of human collaborators, those who had chosen to work with the aliens. Their ship broadcast all the correct identification codes. "We're being hailed," said one of their team, a former computer programmer named Bill. Jack nodded. "Let me handle this." He had studied the Vorax language for months. His pronunciation wasn't perfect, but it would pass basic communication. He responded to the hail with a request to deliver special human prisoners for interrogation. The flagship granted permission to dock. Step 1 complete. On Earth, Mary Johnson sat in what had once been a radio station. Her team had modified the equipment to broadcast on frequencies that would interfere with the Vorax neural network. "Begin transmission," she ordered. The broadcast contained no words, just patterns of sound and energy that human scientists had discovered could disrupt the aliens' shared consciousness. It wouldn't disable them completely, but it would create confusion and doubt. Emotions the Vorax rarely experienced. Similar broadcasts began from 100 locations worldwide. The Vorax commanders suddenly found their neural connections clouded with static and uncertainty. Ellen reached the central power control room. The other team members arrived minutes later, each taking positions at different panels. The Vorax technicians paid little attention. Humans always maintained this equipment. "Now," Alan said quietly. Each Phantom operative pressed a sequence of controls that looked like normal maintenance, but was actually a carefully planned sabotage routine. The power system didn't fail immediately. That would have triggered alarms. Instead, it began a sequence that would cause cascading failures over the next 30 minutes. Alan glanced at his watch. Across the city, 20 other Phantom teams were hitting similar targets. None looked like soldiers. They were janitors, cooks, maintenance workers, even human collaborators who had secretly joined the resistance. On the flagship, Susan and Jack led their small team through the massive alien vessel. They wore the confident expressions of collaborators bringing valuable prisoners. In reality, the prisoners were their most skilled technical experts, their hands bound with restraints designed to look secure, but that could be removed in seconds. "The neural center should be 2 levels down," Susan whispered, consulting a small device that mapped the ship's interior. They entered a transport tube that would take them deeper into the vessel. As they descended, alarms began to sound throughout the ship. "They've discovered us," Jack said. Susan shook her head. "No, that's the planetary alert. Operation Masquerade is working." All across Earth, the Vorax were facing attacks they couldn't understand from enemies they couldn't identify. Power systems failed. Communication networks collapsed. Human collaborators suddenly revealed themselves as resistance fighters. The carefully structured alien occupation was falling into chaos. And on their flagship, the Vorax Supreme Commander watched helplessly as the reports flooded in. For the first time since arriving on Earth, the aliens felt true fear. Jack and Susan were captured just 3 levels away from the Vorax Neural Command Center. A squad of elite guards surrounded them, weapons ready. The aliens had grown suspicious when a routine scan detected unusual energy signatures from their prisoner restraints. "Take them to the Supreme Commander," ordered the guard captain. "He will want to question these humans personally." This wasn't part of the plan, but Jack and Susan exchanged a quick glance. Sometimes failure opened new doors. The guards marched them through long corridors to the heart of the flagship. The Supreme Commander's chamber was a vast room filled with glowing displays showing the status of Vorax forces across Earth. Most of the screens flashed red warnings. The Supreme Commander was taller than other Vorax, his blue skin darker with age and rank. All 4 of his arms bore symbols of battles won on a dozen worlds. He studied the humans with cold eyes. "You are not ordinary prisoners," he said in perfect English. "You are the ones they call Phantoms." Jack straightened his back. "We represent the free people of Earth." The commander made a sound that might have been a laugh. There are no free people on conquered worlds, only survivors waiting to be processed. He turned to Susan. Your resistance is unusual. Most species surrender when faced with superior technology. Maybe you don't understand humans as well as you think, Susan replied. On Earth, Alan's team had successfully disabled the Western Command Center's power systems, but they were trapped inside the building as Vorax hunter squads searched for saboteurs. They're moving floor by floor, said Kate, who had survived the Los Angeles mission with Alan. We need to get to the roof. Alan nodded. The maintenance elevator still has emergency power. They moved carefully through darkened corridors. 2 Vorax soldiers appeared ahead. Before the aliens could raise their weapons, Kate disabled them with a small device that emitted a pulse of energy, calibrated to disrupt Vorax neural functions. That's our last one, she said, pocketing the now empty device. We'll have to rely on being regular maintenance workers again, Ellen replied. They'd reached the elevator and rode it to the roof. The city below was in chaos. Explosions lit up the night as phantom teams struck targets across Seattle. The Vorax ships trying to respond kept changing course, confused by contradictory orders from their failing command network. On the flagship, the Supreme Commander continued questioning Jack and Susan. He didn't notice when one of his officers received an urgent message and quietly left the room. Your species is unique in its resistance methods, the commander said, but ultimately futile. We have conquered 12 worlds before yours. An explosion rocked the ship, cutting off his words. The lights flickered. What was that? He demanded. No one answered. The neural network that usually provided instant information was fragmented by Mary's disruption broadcasts. Then a second explosion hit, closer this time. Jack smiled. Looks like your perfect system isn't so perfect. The prisoners that had accompanied them, the technical experts whose restraints were designed to be removed easily, had escaped during the confusion of their capture. While Jack and Susan distracted the Supreme Commander, the technicians had reached the ship's engine control room. Alarms blared throughout the flagship. The Supreme Commander received reports of systems failing across the vessel. The humans had planted small devices that disrupted the ship's neural connections, similar to how Mary's broadcasts affected the Vorax themselves. Impossible, the commander whispered. Susan saw their opportunity. As the guard nearest her turned toward a new explosion, she struck, using moves learned in Special Forces training. Jack followed her lead, disarming another guard and grabbing his weapon. They fought their way out of the command chamber, using the aliens' confusion against them. The Vorax, used to fighting as a coordinated unit through their neural network, struggled to respond when that connection was disrupted. We need to get to the main control hub, Jack said as they ran through the corridors. Susan nodded. If we can disable the flagship's network, it will break their command structure across the entire planet. Behind them, the Supreme Commander shouted orders that no one could follow. For the first time in the history of the Vorax Confederacy, their perfect system was breaking down. 3 days after Operation Masquerade began, the tide of war had turned. Jack and Susan had succeeded in disabling the flagship's central neural hub. Without their coordinating network, Vorax units across Earth fell into disarray. Some continued fighting. Others retreated to defensive positions. A few even surrendered to human forces. In New York City, the Vorax Supreme Commander made his last stand. After escaping the disabled flagship in an emergency shuttle, he had gathered his most loyal troops in what remained of the United Nations building, the same place where first contact had occurred 18 months earlier. General Henry Walsh watched the alien stronghold through binoculars from a nearby rooftop. Unlike the Phantom operatives, he wore a uniform today. The time for hiding was past. Status report, he said into a radio. Diane Powell's voice came through clearly. All teams in position, sir. Phantom units have disabled their perimeter security. Walsh nodded with satisfaction. The Phantoms had made this moment possible. Operating in plain clothes, They had infiltrated the Vorax defenses over the past day, appearing as refugees seeking shelter or human collaborators bringing supplies. "Begin the final push," Walsh ordered. Earth's remaining conventional military forces moved forward, tanks, infantry, and the few aircraft that had survived the invasion. But mixed among them, wearing no uniforms, were hundreds of phantom operatives, indistinguishable from civilians caught in the battle. The Supreme Commander watched the approaching forces with growing despair. His neural connection to the Confederacy fleet was gone. Reports from his remaining units made no sense. Some claimed humans could appear and disappear at will. Others reported being attacked by their own kind. "Fight to the last soldier," he ordered his troops. "The Confederacy does not surrender." But his words rang hollow. Without their neural network, individual Vorax began making their own decisions for the first time. Many chose survival over certain death. As the battle raged around the United Nations building, Susan West and Jack Miller arrived in New York. They had returned to Earth aboard a captured Vorax shuttle and immediately joined the final assault. "Just like old times," Jack said, now carrying a weapon instead of diplomatic papers. Susan smiled grimly. "Except now we're winning." They advanced with a mixed group of soldiers and phantoms. The uniformed troops engaged Vorax defenders directly while phantom operatives slipped through gaps in the alien defenses, striking from unexpected angles. Alan Garcia and his team had also reached New York. They moved through underground tunnels, bypassing the main battle entirely. Their target was the building's power and communication systems. "Same plan as Seattle," Alan told his team. "Make it look like a system failure, not an attack." The Supreme Commander's guards were the last to break. When humans suddenly appeared within what they thought was a secure command center, the aliens fought ferociously. But they were fighting an enemy that didn't behave like any they had faced before. An enemy that had learned to use confusion and unpredictability as weapons. When General Walsh finally entered the command center, the Supreme Commander stood alone, his troops dead or fled. "You fought well," the Vorax leader said, "but the Confederacy will return with greater forces." Walsh shook his head. "I don't think so. Your reports will show that humans aren't worth the cost." 2 weeks later, the remaining Vorax ships lifted off from Earth, leaving behind damaged cities, but an unbroken human spirit. Intercepted communications confirmed that the Confederacy had ordered a full withdrawal. In a small ceremony held deep within the Rocky Mountains base, General Walsh addressed the key members of the Phantom Protocol. "Today we honor what cannot be publicly acknowledged," he said, looking at Susan, Jack, Alan, Diane, and Mary. "The soldiers who won this war by not looking like soldiers at all." He raised a glass. "To the Phantoms, proof that humanity's greatest strength is not our weapons, but our ability to adapt and overcome." Across the stars, word spread among spacefaring civilizations. Earth had defeated the undefeatable Vorax Confederacy, and more importantly, humans were not to be underestimated. Their deadliest soldiers wore no uniforms, followed no standard tactics, and could be anyone, anywhere. The lesson was clear: never judge humanity's strength by what you can see.